Do current levels of worker anxiety reflect the true health of the labor market? And who is more worried about work, employers or employees? Welcome to Macro Talk, where we examine business news through a big picture lens to help leaders and workers stay ahead of change. I'm your host, Hope King, and in this first episode of our Workforce Reckoning series is Karin Kimbrough, the Chief Economist at LinkedIn. Good to have you with us, Karin.
Thanks, Hope. It's great to be here.
I know that maybe the word reckoning seems heavy-handed to describe what's going on. And I think where I was coming from, and who knows, maybe I'll change the entire series title after our conversation, is that, workers are reckoning with the skills they have to now adopt in the age of AI, and employers and companies have to reckon with the really unprecedented level of uncertainty that's now way up here, whereas before may have been a little bit lower. So from that perspective, do you think it's too dramatic to say that the workforce, the labor market is going through a reckoning right now?
I think that's absolutely the right word. The labor force is going through a reckoning. This is a transformative moment. And part of it is due to AI, part of it is due to macro cyclical forces that I'm sure we'll get into. But overall, the workforce is changing at a really rapid pace. And a lot of this is due to the fact that AI has come on stream and has really changed where we work, how we work, and the things that we do at work.
Well, thank you for validating kind of the intuition. And, I'm not the only one that's really used this term. PwC earlier in the year talked about this in one of their reports, that there's a reckoning underway in consumer markets. They pointed to four big trends, the macro trends that we're going to talk about, which is decreasing employee morale, skepticism toward AI, attrition, and then just tension with workplace culture, whether it's RTO or not. But I want to get back to the first two questions that I led the video off with the show with, which is the level of anxiety that workers are feeling and whether or not that reflects the true health of the labor market. Economists do a really good job of level setting. So level set with us here. What is the true health of the labor market at the moment?
Well, we certainly try to do a good job. And I'll tell you, at LinkedIn, we're really excited because I think our data gives us a unique perspective. And right now, if I were looking at the labor market and gauging the health, I would say it's pretty darn good, right? We are still on the relatively low end of unemployment rate. So here in the US, it's 4.2%, which is exactly what central makers would say is about the normal natural run rate for the unemployment to not be overly heating the economy, but not really slowing it either. And at the same time, we're seeing labor force participation kind of hold in there. So it's actually not a bad labor market. It's pretty much in balance. Demand and supply, generally speaking, are equal. But it doesn't always feel that way. And you mentioned the anxiety, the reckoning, the element of uncertainty. So a lot of what's happening is people are feeling the effects of a labor market that was, I would say, almost too strong, too healthy, too turbocharged a few years back. And now that it's settling into what we would consider a more normal long-term historical level and pace, it feels a little sluggish. Hiring is slower, quits are lower, and jobs are harder to find than they were a few years ago. So all of that just doesn't feel as good.
The other question we started the video off with was whether or not workers or employers were sort of more anxious at the moment. You have big tech companies, right? Like big tech companies are still laying off people and they're talking about AI being the reason. But generally speaking, who has it tougher right now?
Oh, I definitely think the employees are feeling like they've got it tougher right now. I mentioned earlier that things felt a little bit more sluggish, and a lot of that is cyclical and macro driven. But there's an element of AI that's driving the anxiety too. That's like this new technology, this new tool. How am I going to use it? Is it going to be a threat to me, or is it going to somehow complement me? So I think employees are feeling a little bit more threatened. We see that in our own data. We do every 2 weeks a survey of members, and we ask them, how are you feeling about, your prospects of getting a job, keeping a job? How does your career health feel to you? And right now, we're seeing confidence at a 5-year low. So this is lower even than during the pandemic. So our members who are both job seekers and folks working are telling us, I don't feel too confident. So a lot of anxiety is coming through that way. I think on the flip side, Hope, you could say, well, how are the employers feeling? And they are probably feeling like they've got a puzzle to figure out. How do I bring AI on stream into my operations, into my processes in a way that I can still risk manage, that's going to bring my talent along with me and not alienate them, and at the same time deliver whatever I need in terms of productivity, creativity, efficiency. So they've got a puzzle to solve, but I don't think they have quite as much anxiety as the employee does.
I guess, yeah, the puzzle, I guess, is around operations. And maybe I'm being too empathetic to the leadership challenges because I know that those changes ultimately result in a lot of job losses or job creation. So that's why I ask. Corporations are entities, like, you know, like I'm not like caring about them like a pet or anything, but it's just something that I think about because leaders are in those positions that, again, ultimately trickle down. I won't hide my excitement in having you on the show. You were one of the people that I most really certainly wanted, especially to kick off this entire series because LinkedIn for me as a platform is where I want to focus a lot of what I'm doing with Macro Talk, but also because the platform itself has become an ecosystem for workers and for businesses to share everything that's going on in sort of real time. And so something that I've been wondering, especially when it comes to the disconnect between hard data, soft data, sentiment data, federal data, is where those gaps are and why they persist. And for LinkedIn specifically, you guys have data points on, what is it, 1 billion people now, I think, right, on the platform?
1.2 billion members on the platform.
So how closely does that tie to the data that the federal government publishes, that we see? You must see this sort of trend in real time, maybe faster than some of the backwards looking data that we report on, from BLS or something like that.
Yeah, so it's like an incredible privilege to have the role I have as chief economist at LinkedIn because the data is just so phenomenal. It's so vast. It's real time. There's an element of granularity, meaning we can see what's happening on individual career journeys, as well as collectively, like how are architects doing? How are project managers doing? How are journalists and economists doing? And we can see that by seniority and age. We can see it by gender. We can see it by geography, whether you're in a big city or a small town. So a lot of that helps to kind of fill out a whole picture of the labor market by occupation or by industry through the business cycle. And I don't mean to geek out on it, but honestly, it's a dream to be able to kind of surface questions and answers in this data. So you asked about the soft and the hard data. Obviously, for me, soft data is a lot about sentiment. We have our own sentiment surveys. We can see the sentiment that's being produced by publicly available data. And then there's the hard data, which is like what's actually happening. Are people getting a job? Are they leaving a job? Are they producing something? Are they selling? Are they buying? And all of that we see on our platform too. And so when we take our data and stack it against, say, US federal government data, what we find is actually in some cases our data leads. So for example, we have a measure of entrepreneurial activity, so startups, and we can see how startups are faring, how many are being created before the US government's data comes out. We can see hiring data 6 weeks before the federal government's data comes out. And we share all that on our platform because our kind of vision and mission is really to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce. So if I can go on and share, hey, this is what we're seeing in hiring for this month, or this is what we're seeing for hiring in California versus New York, or here's where the jobs are. That's my goal. So we don't keep it to ourselves. We absolutely share it in an aggregated, anonymized way to help people kind of figure out where their opportunities are.
That's great. I mean, that was sort of where I was getting to, was whether or not your data was fresher, right, in some sense. And I love the fact that it is now, in your words, a leading indicator for what we'll eventually see in some of the government data. The really crazy stat that you guys published earlier in the year for me was that skills for jobs are set to change by 70% by 2030. And to me, that is like thinking about what, you do every day, what I do every day. That 70% of the things that I am good at doing now is going to completely change. Like that's very
It
hard
can be
to
scary.
but it's also hard to imagine then if, again, the show is about helping people get to the future before the future gets to them. Well, what do? How do you, in this moment, change 70% of your skill set? Or is it a gradual change that by 2030, when we look back to this conversation, we'll have said, hey, look, I was in the process of that change all along?
I think it's the latter, Hope. I really, if anything I can do today to help people think about they have agency to navigate a more uncertain time, a new work environment, that's what I want to do today, is to say there are ways to navigate this. This is not an overnight impact. So that skill statistic you mentioned is indeed one from us. And what we did is I'll just explain it really briefly. We looked at the kinds of skills that were required for jobs back in, say, 2015, 2016, and then tracked over time. If I looked at all the jobs in a particular occupation, how did the core skills that were either showcased by people who worked in that occupation or in job descriptions, how did that change over time? And what we found was that indeed there was an iteration, like an iterative process. Year by year, things moved. And we, got through about, I'd say from 2015 to about 2022 or 2023. And we said, wow, look at all the change that's already happened. Let's imagine that pace continues to 2030. How much will we have seen in terms of rotation? That's where we got 70%. A lot of the rotation, though, is due to new tools and technologies around AI and generative AI specifically. So let me give you an example. So there might have been a particular set of skills that a project manager needed to have. Now, the project manager will still need certain, I'll say, human people skills, but some of the technical skills will have iterated since 2015 vastly. There'll be new software requirements, new programs they're using, new ways to collaborate. All of that is evolving year by year. So it's more the technical skills that are iterating. It's not the human skills. It's not the need to be showing up as a leader or inspiring teams or being a great communicator. All of those are still hugely important.
So then the context of this number, and if I think back to pre-internet, pre-phone, if we were looking at the same question from the early 90s to the early 2000s, would you have said then something very similar, that at that time, you would have expected 70% of the skills back in the 80s to have changed by the time we got to like the 2000s? Or is there something different that's happening now to make this a more significant data point?
I think it's more significant because AI is probably, as a new technology, impacting us more quickly than, saying, prior technologies. And that's in part because AI is something that's going to be, or already is, frankly, widely accessible to us. Like, we can pull it up on our phone. We're using it at work. There are applications employers are purchasing for us to use to become more efficient. All of that means that we're already able to play around with it, both for our personal life and also for professional life. That's not the case when you think about the internet. People needed to have a desktop computer. It was expensive, and they needed, dial up, and that took a long time, and every house had to be wired for it. And so there was a long lead time to see the effects of integrating new technology in the past. And I think now it's a lot quicker. So in some ways, I'm telling you, hey, AI adoption is going to be a lot faster than previous innovative technology waves. But on the other hand, I'm also telling you, it's not going to happen overnight. Mm-hmm. When we look at AI adoption, for example, and I'll give you an example here. What we see is that there are certain industries and certain kinds of companies that are adopting AI more quickly than others. So larger companies are adopting more quickly. Companies in the industries of like financial services, professional services, obviously technology, you're seeing a lot more broad AI adoption across their talent than you are seeing in other industries. If I look at small businesses, for example, businesses. 90% of everybody who's employed globally works for a small business. They are lagging the large businesses in terms of adoption. So this is going to be a process. It is going to take time before you see every last bit of adoption happening. And I think that's what I want to tell people is we have the time. It's just important to start to learn how to build AI, what I call AI literacy or AI fluency, that ability to use generative AI tools for your own purposes so that you can shed some of the tasks that really you don't need to spend as much time on. And you're kind of just, I'll call it like evaluating the output to decide if you think it's good enough. And then you can spend more time on the things that are cognitively way more interesting to do, more strategic, more around relationship building. So that's part of the skill rotation is where are we rotating away from certain tasks to new tasks.
Okay, so this condensed upheaval of skill sets, from 2025 to 2030 is much faster than what we saw over the first three decades of the establishment of the internet. Okay, that's great context to have. It's fascinating that you said that small businesses are lagging behind a little bit here on AI. You have the benefit of being my last taping of the first episode, which means that I can ask you to fact check everybody else that I've been talking to. And one of those experts is Kelly Monahan, the managing director of the Upwork Research Institute. And, obviously her platform is catering toward the freelance environment and those workers. And her argument was that actually freelancers and people who are these entrepreneurs in her mind are actually upskilling on AI faster. So square that with me with what you just said, which is that you see small businesses lacking behind. Is it just a nuance of what, how we're defining small business and freelancers maybe in her world being maybe more for the white collar knowledge worker type of worker?
Yes, the way I would think about it is I'm talking about small businesses that maybe have 10 to say 50 or 100 employees. And their challenges in adopting AI are at least twofold. One is they need to upskill their talent, and that's costly, especially when you don't have a lot of extra resources on hand to create a upskilling program. They also have the challenge of wanting to hire AI expertise. It's expensive. It's competitive to find. We already know in our data that hiring for folks who have let's call it AI technical expertise, that's running 30% faster than anybody else. I mean, those people get hired very easily and for, a premium. So small businesses are struggling to compete with that. So I'm talking about that in terms of the challenges for them when they are adopting AI. But what I think Kelly's talking about, and I agree with her, is that the future is very entrepreneurial. And when you ask me hey, Karin, what does the future of work look like? I'm going to tell you it's businesses adopting AI at scale over time. We're going to start with the large companies. Eventually, we'll get to the smaller ones. It's also individuals like LinkedIn members who are becoming far more entrepreneurial. So they are crafting their expertise and their services and selling it to businesses. They may sell to more than one business. We already know from our data that people are likely to have more jobs now than they did in the past. So for example, by our measure, if you are starting your career today as a new grad, you're going to have twice as many jobs as someone who maybe started their career 20 years ago through the life of your career. So I would agree with Kelly. It is a nuance of yes, the gig economy is still here. The entrepreneurial spirit is going to be even more important in the future with AI. But I also think that small businesses as entities are still lagging large companies.
I'm glad you brought up that stat because I was going to bring it up myself, which is that, again, I want to just repeat it, which is people entering the workforce today are on pace to hold twice as many jobs over their careers. I think I have a very skewed sense of the job market being in journalism because our upheaval has been, I think, much more dramatic than in others recently. So I'm feeling that for sure. In my first job, I was with one company for just 7 years, and in journalism, I've had been with 4 or 5 different news outlets, right? So to me, that's a personal anecdote. And I think the other question that I have for both you and Kelly on this idea of being more entrepreneurial for workers is there's then even less stability than what we previously had when we had just had, one job, or we expected just to have one job for a very long time. How are leaders going to be dealing with that going forward? In some ways, I know from from talking to a lot of entrepreneurs who have a lot of money and they want to hire, that they love this idea of being asset light. And asset is usually synonymous with human resources or with people.
Yes.
And in my mind, I'm like, from a business perspective, of course, I'm asset light. I'm doing this myself. But from an organizational perspective, you have a lot of workers who are then left without benefits or who are left without the certainty of that biweekly, bi-monthly paycheck. So from a leadership perspective, how would you advise these senior decision makers to come to terms with the mix of their workforce, of how much should be sort of in the sort of freelance sort of world, coming from that labor pool versus having full-time employees? And this will give workers, I think, some transparency on how they should be thinking of marketing themselves as workers.
Well, it's a great question. And I think part of it is going to depend on the industry you're talking about. So, for example, let's take my former industry, which is financial services, and banks are generally very heavily regulated, right? So they probably are going to be less inclined to want to have a really large proportion of their workforce that is vendor or contract workers or part-time. It's just a little bit harder to kind of keep everything moving in the way you want it in concert, aligned with regulations, right? But the flip side is that the entertainment industry, for example, probably is highly amenable to the idea of entrepreneurial / gig work, activities. So I think it depends on the industry a little bit. If you're talking about how do leaders square the circle with that, I think part of it is around how much risk do they want to take? How important is culture? Because culture is harder to preserve when you have a lot of different people who aren't necessarily full-time coming into the office, and then I think there's also an element, we mentioned risk, we mentioned like the industry. There's also an element of just like, what is the type of work that they want people to do? And I will tell you right now, when I talk to leaders, they are figuring out that puzzle. They know that they want talent. And they also know that they need to compete on being efficient. And here's my little plug. Give me a second here.
Yeah.
Eventually, we're all going to have access to AI. Eventually, companies are either going to build or buy the best AI for what their objectives are. And when we get to that point, the competitive edge between businesses is going to be their talent. It's going to be who has the best relationships with their customers and partners, who articulates the most inspiring vision for their colleagues and teammates, who's most collaborative so that you're surfacing the best ideas, getting the best of everyone's creativity and innovation. All of that is the human side. So when I look far ahead, and I'm going to leapfrog some of the painful transitions we might be going through in the workforce, I really still believe that the human skills are going to be paramount as AI kind of begins to diffuse through the workplace.
I like that. And I hear this quite often because, I'm talking to a lot of experts and is it getting through? Is that message getting through that human element is the most, okay. How are you seeing it reflected?
Okay. So even as early as, very at the beginning of this year, so 2025, you go to a place like Davos where there are a lot of leaders of companies, mainly large ones, and the narrative, the message around the importance of investing in their talent was resonating. It wasn't, say, LinkedIn preaching this. It was a lot of leaders of many different types of companies saying this is what we need to do.
Well, on that note, and Davos is a great example of a great convening event where senior leaders from all over the world go, CEOs, billionaires. That is a limiting factor for people who are not at that scale to be able to network. And especially for young people who are coming into a hybrid work environment, they're not getting the opportunities that you and I had growing up to be in an office and to actually have to interface with people.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned being in the office. And one of the things that we were able to see all through the pandemic was how people applied to different types of jobs. And obviously there were people that gravitated to the remote work and the greater flexibility, and a whole lot of back then, let's say the millennials and Gen Zs were applying to the non-remote work. They wanted to be in the office. They wanted to see the behavior modeled. They wanted the connections, the coaching. And so they weren't pushing back against coming back into the office. It was some of the older workers that were more reluctant. But I think the kind of, you mentioned the skills. You're asking, is it digital skills or the more human skills? I really actually truly mean it's the human skills of in person, being persuasive, being empathetic, that listening, that investing in others. I don't believe humans are going to change very quickly. I think the world of work is changing, but I think humans change only very slowly, probably over eons of time. And so we still like each other. We like to be with each other. We like to sit around the fire. We are motivated by storytelling, which is a super powerful human skill. So as much as you might expect that generative AI will start drafting for us, it will do data analysis for us, it will create content for us. The curation of the content that's created, figuring out where it should land, how it should be targeted, that's the human part. The data analysis might tell you, well, here's a comparison of a before and after, but figuring out how to tell a story around that, I think that's still the human part, understanding the nuances. And it doesn't really change, I think. I think we were still looking to do this when we were new grads ourselves. We were sort of expected to understand the business, but we were also expected to figure out, how to deliver a story for our team. And that I think hasn't changed at all.
No, and I don't disagree with you. I think it was more, I guess, trying to tease out how people who are not physically with their coworkers, how they're actually learning these skills. And, I also asked that in the context of the makeup of the labor force, which Gen Z has now overtaken boomers as the age group, right, in size, for the first time. And it's been that way since, I think, the third quarter of 2023. And what that also will do to culture. Gen Z have a very different way of communicating. Totally. They are generally, I think, more entrepreneurial minded in general.
Correct.
And so as they rise through the ranks, what do you expect to happen to the culture of organizations, to the operation of companies of all sizes?
I actually am fascinated by the generational composition story. It's a slow moving one, but it fascinates, predominated. And they are looking for different things already. They expect mental health benefits. That was not something that a Gen Xer would ever ask about or inquire about in an interview process. So they're showing up a lot more authentic. They are more willing to respond well to authenticity. They are more willing to embrace this idea that they want diversity. They're looking for it. They're also looking for a way for, and you mentioned this earlier, this entrepreneurial spirit. So they're looking to move around. They want a lot more flexibility. I don't mean flexibility in terms of, am I working from home or working in the office? They want flexibility in terms of a career path that means maybe I'm going to start out in an advertising industry, but at some point I might move to biotech, or I may, end up working in finance. And so there's a broader perspective on their career than I would say someone who is a boomer or a Gen Xer had, who probably said, I grew up in finance and I'm sticking in finance. Does that make sense? So we're looking kind of at this career lattice. It's not a ladder, it's a lattice where you're moving around, switching industries, perhaps even switching occupations.
And are companies, equipped to be able to absorb that type of background and experience?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a hot take here.
Okay.
I think companies want it. I think they are looking for that agility. I think they know they need talent to be very adaptable and very agile. And so I think they're actually going to embrace that spirit that Gen Z brings. These Gen Z folks are completely digitally native. They're going to be far more productive than any of us using the new Gen AI tools. And two, because of that desire to have this, I'll call it expansive career flexibility across whether it's industries or occupations, and the willingness to do that, I think they're going to actually be quite successful. And here's why. When we look right now at what the path to the C-suite looks like, and just compare it to 10 years ago, it is already changing. So 10 years ago, the path to the C-suite was 90% of the people in C-suite had gotten there by being in one kind of vertical occupation and in one industry. And you just climbed that ladder and did it the best you could. Fast forward to now, the path to the C-suite has much more diversity already. So people are coming in with broader experiences across different occupations, different industries, and it's now more like only 60% of the people in the C-suite have that single vertical of one industry, one occupation. The other 40% have done a bunch of stuff. I think that trend will continue. So I actually do think that, to answer a question that you asked a bit ago, I think leadership is going to be looking for that agility, that adaptability, that ability to kind of pivot into new things, because that's what the technology is ushering in, is faster and faster change.
So you're saying that in order to keep up with the times, you've got to hire people who have been keeping up with the times in that word agility. And I asked this question in a very serious way, also because if you look at a General Motors and a Walmart, you've got currently these leaders who have been with the company since they were interns. Mary Barra was an intern famously
Yes.
at GM, and Doug McMillan started as somebody who worked in trailers and warehouses. What happens to companies when leaders don't come from within that, let's say, long track? What do you think will happen?
Well, obviously, these leaders who've been at the company from day zero, they are huge culture carriers and visionaries, and I don't think anything competes with that. But what I will say is, even in a very traditional company, you could start to create pathways for people to have a lot more internal mobility, and that is something that we have seen in the last few years. So it's not that you have to leave that company in order to get that new experience. You might be saying, I need a role where I get P&L experience. I need a role where I have operational experience, risk management experience, talent management or HR experience. You could see people on their career journeys staying within one company, but having a lot larger range of experiences. That's one thing. And the other thing I would say, and this maybe gets back to your question specifically, is that every company eventually wants to kind of have some rotation of new blood, new ideas, new perspectives. And so no company wants to have exactly 100% of their employees, with long tenure. You want some rotation. And in fact, I would say, if I bring it back to the macro, one of the issues in the current labor market is that attrition has been so low. People are not leaving their jobs at a particularly rapid rate. And companies, believe it or not, have not actually been laying off at an excessive rate. And so you've got these people who have longer and longer tenures. And companies are looking to kind of revitalize a little bit in this age of efficiency. And so they want to see a little more churn.
That's fascinating. I mean, I think when you're on LinkedIn, your timeline, or Instagram, or whatever, your timeline will show you all the stuff that you're already fearful of. So if you think layoffs are bad, the algorithm is going to reinforce that. So it's very hard for people to get drawn out, right, of their echo chambers, which is why I love to have these conversations. I want to round out our conversation with just a few quick topics, because I think we've done a lot to talk about kind of the reckoning and the layers of the reckoning and what will happen with culture changing, with Gen Z and more entrepreneurial, like-minded people leading. But just really quickly on the topic of layoffs, do you think that we are extrapolating a little bit too much from big tech headlines to the rest of the economy? I think I know what the answer is. But I do believe that that could be one of the core issues of the sentiment that we feel that is not reflected in the hard data.
Here's how I think about it. For a very long time, the tech sector was just adding a net adder of jobs to our economy. They were hiring, and within a year or two would almost double their size because they were growing so fast and it was profitable. And the way they scaled was by adding more headcount. That's obviously changed now with AI and generative AI. So that change is partly what we feel. We don't see tech being just a huge net adder of jobs. Tech is still hiring, but they are also, like many other industries, occasionally realigning the size of their workforce
Mm-hmm.
through reductions in force, through layoffs. And that's just new. And so I think there is a little element of, I don't want to say overreaction, because being laid off is it's painful, and it's hard. So I don't want to minimize it, but what I want to say is that's a normal part of a lot of mature industries. And I think tech has just matured into that space. And when you look at the size of layoffs overall in the tech space, it's extremely small. It's like 2% of all the layoffs that we see. And if you look at the data in the US,
Mm-hmm.
there's 1.7 million layoffs a month in the US on average. No, it was just a lot lower the last few years. It was kind of closer to like 1.5 million. And you run that for a few years and you have a lot more people on the rolls who haven't rotated out or haven't changed jobs. But the truth is, we aren't seeing excessive levels of layoffs, either in aggregate or specifically in the tech sector.
So are we extrapolating then too much from tech layoffs to the broader economy?
I think so. I think
Is
so.
it is that just because of the size of the impact of these companies?
Well, these are fast growing companies, and they're at the forefront of really all the latest innovations. If I include biotech and
Mm-hmm.
software and hardware, there's just so much innovative change happening. And for the last couple of years, it's just been the only way is up. So if we're not still always going up, but we're sort of maybe going a little bit sideways or taking a pause, it's not the end of the world. As an economist, I see everything in cycles.
Yeah.
And my view is that I see tech hiring, and let me leave you with this stat, Hope. When we look at which industries right now, today, are hiring faster than they were last year,
Mm-hmm.
financial services and tech.
Wow.
Sometimes healthcare, depends on the month. Everyone else is hiring more slowly than they were a year ago. But tech is actually hiring more quickly. It's just that they are rotating the composition of their talent, and making alignment changes for what their new objectives are with generative AI. So it is not super painless, but net tech is still hiring, as is
So,
finance.
and this cycle, do you think how long will this cycle last?
If you're asking about this cycle of somewhat sluggish labor markets that have normalized but don't feel super dynamic and the
But
momentum is
also,
low.
yes,
Mm-hmm.
and also the faster hiring in these two areas that people probably would scratch their heads and say, well, that's countered all the headlines that I've seen.
Yeah, well, I actually think this could continue for a while. I think these are two industries that have been early adopters and integrators of generative AI technology, and they're seeing growth. Even amid all the uncertainty and volatility, they're seeing growth and they're investing strategically. So I don't see any reason why this wouldn't continue. I
And
just think other industries need to catch up.
a while. I know it's hard. I know you don't. I know
No,
you. I know.
sure.
What?
This is
How
my
long is a
job.
while? Yeah.
I easily could say 3 years. I could see
Okay.
3 years. And do recessions happen eventually? And can I predict it? Not well.
Right.
But in the meantime, there's a lot of momentum behind the innovation, the growth, the productivity that we're seeing. And I don't see why companies would stop investing in that. And they will invest and they will also hire. The trick is, are they hiring for the talent that and skills that people are currently offering, or are they hiring for some new skill that many people don't yet have? And that gap is where sometimes things can get painful.
I think the other reason why I started out with the framing of that question is because a lot of the leaders in tech are much louder and they're bigger personalities than other industries. And again, just the
Yes.
size of the companies, the stock price, right? They're over indexed on impact on so many other ways that they seem to speak for the economy. So, and that was really the nature of the question. Yeah, go ahead.
I, I'm telling you how I see it when I look either historically at what's happened in the past in the economy or what I
Hmm.
see in our data. Obviously, I'm on the camp of like in the future we will have a net add of new jobs. I already see new jobs on our platform that are growing. But I understand that the transition can be painful, but I'm actually, I would say, pretty sanguine that in the end, AI is going to affect most jobs, some earlier than others. and that we'll all be using it in some way integrated into our skills and tasks.
Yeah, I no, I mean, again, this is why I set up this platform because we just have to, in my industry, we just have to operate in a different way, talking about stories because the headline, to me, headlines are never the story. The headline is the effect of what the story has been for X period of time. And that's really kind of what I want to get at. And you know who I'm referring to. I mean, when you've got the CEO of Anthropic telling everybody that he expects a 20% unemployment rate, that's going to send a lot of shockwaves, and that's been occupying
Yes.
a lot of the oxygen inside of our brains and in the realm of this conversation. And so that's why I also brought up the point earlier of the personalities in tech really outshine the voices in other industries where, Walmart CEO doesn't get the same type of coverage, right? Depending on what he says. I mean, it's still, yes, very sizable, but not in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously the loud, big, influential, and really smart voices are going to get a lot of attention. But I'll just add my voice here. At LinkedIn, what we see is an incredible acceleration in the pace of change, but I don't see wholesale jobs being disrupted. In fact, what I'm seeing is jobs are still intact, but the tasks and skills that people are using are changing. So it's not that the job is going away, it's that the job is transforming. And that's why I think earlier on I said this is just a transformative moment for AI.
I know. And you also know how people feel about words like transformative. I mean, they want something like a little bit more
Fair.
concrete. It's hard, right? I mean, it's hard to have a hot mid take. It's either a hot take that's super negative in one way or the other, and it's hard to have the real middle rise
Yes.
to the forefront.
Well, my job as an economist is not to be super exciting. It's to kind of report on what I think is right. And
But it is
honestly,
exciting. I
I think
think
we're
it's exciting to know
straddling.
what the truth is.
The truth is, we're straddling two different forces. One is cyclical, which meant we had a lot of hiring people at high wages with great flexibility 3 years ago, and companies are still digesting and processing that, and that's why hiring is slow. At the same time, companies are figuring out what the future looks like with generative AI, and they know things are changing, but they're not quite sure. And so they're slowly but gradually integrating that AI. And that's also causing some transformation uncertainty. And that's kind of why you see, new grads are maybe having a tougher time than before. But honestly, I am quite confident that even if unemployment rises a little bit this year, we are going to have still a pretty robust labor market going forward. And that should be for the long haul.
And that's why I want to get out of the business of writing these horrible headlines because it's not really ultimately the bigger picture. And to me, the bigger picture is the truth, right? It's not just one thing. It's always a lot of things all at once. Last topic here, which is for new grads, fastest growing. You just talked about how finance and tech are actually hiring faster than
Yes.
we have imagined. But there are other areas of the economy that maybe if you're a younger worker, if you're a recent or you're about to graduate college, student should be looking at, and what are those based on your data at LinkedIn?
Yeah, so here's one that we've been looking at a lot. Think about data centers. There's been a proliferation of constructing data centers globally. Well, data centers actually need humans in them. Those data centers need care and feeding by humans. And so there's a proliferation of data center technician and specialist roles. There is a proliferation and high, fast growth of roles around drones. Drones are used for everything from selling real estate to
Mm-hmm.
creating, synthetic, fireworks in the sky.
Yeah.
Companies are delivering packages. So there's a huge demand for drone pilots, drone instructors, drone operators. There's also a lot of jobs around program, event management and coordination, marketing specialists. So even as there are lots of ways in which you feel like, oh, maybe generative AI is taking over skills that new grads or folks without a bachelor's could do, you still need human oversight to kind of pull all the pieces together to make sure it hits right. It's got the right
Yeah.
nuance, the right cultural tick. And none of that can be done, I think, confidently by just letting AI at it without some human gauging. So we've got a lot of roles right now that are still opportunities for new grads. It is hard for them to get hired right now. It is a struggle, and more so than it is for millennials or Gen X. But what I would say is this: if you're willing to be pretty flexible about the industry and not get too overly focused on, I've got to be, in this type of role, just get your foot in the door, because the labor market is a lot more flexible than it used to be. And you can definitely move around when the wind's at your back and the cycle is on an upturn. That's your chance then to pivot to your dream industry or dream role.
I hear a lot of optimism from you because you see the data and you interact with it. The reality for a lot of people, and you see these stories on your timeline, I'm sure, as much as I see
Sure.
mine. I have applied to 200 places. People who are, being super vulnerable
Yes.
and transparent about that. What is
We
your
see that, by the
advice?
way. Yeah, okay.
What?
So by the way, I want to validate that, because I don't want to just spin a bunch of positive, like,
Yeah,
hey,
let's
it's going
talk
to be
about
okay. Okay,
exactly.
so we absolutely see that on our platform. So we see people who, there are fewer jobs than there used to be a couple of years ago. That's just the truth,
Right.
because employers are a little bit less eager to hire, so they're not putting as many jobs out there. And there's many more applicants per role. And in
Hmm.
some cases, we're seeing twice the number of applications per role. Okay, so it is not anybody's figment of their imagination. It is harder. And, employers tell us, oh my God, I opened that job for, 3 days. I was inundated with applications. I just closed it. I couldn't, have any more applications. So I've had this myself for the job I opened. So here's the deal. So that's absolutely real. But what do I tell people
Hmm.
is, this is, one, not going to last forever. This is a moment in time. Like I said, some cyclical forces, some AI uncertainty is keeping things slow. Two, there are industries and jobs out there, definitely seeing hiring in, the energy sector and also alternative energy sectors. There's lots
Hmm.
of places that are still hiring. And three, the focus is on skills.
Mm.
So to the extent that you can curate the skills that are exactly in demand, it will make you a better match. And LinkedIn has been trying to do a lot of with our own AI to try to help people find the exact best match for where they should apply, and say, oh, you're a low match here, don't do that, but you're a high match there. And
Hmm.
also on the employer side, helping them figure out, how do I, whittle down this set of applications so I don't get 3,000 applications for one role.
So where does that one person start? The one who is sharing a spreadsheet of every single company that they've applied for and the status of being ghosted or not. In a separate conversation in this particular series, I spoke with the chief education strategy officer at Handshake, and her perspective,
Yeah.
Christine Cruz Rivera, her perspective is that sometimes students are applying to too many places. If they're applying to 200, that they are kind of spraying and praying, or that they are just kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall and see what hits, and that actually is detrimental to the overall process of hiring, because then employers are over inundated. They have low quality candidates, perhaps. So, again, where should somebody
Yes.
start if they've had months of struggle to find a job?
Honestly, statistically, your best shot is through your network, which isn't very fun, because again, when you're a new grad, how big is your network? Who do you know? That's probably related to who your parents know, right? It doesn't seem like a very fair starting line. But working, contacts that you know at those places, and as you said, curating that list down so you're not just applying to hundreds and hundreds of jobs, but applying to the ones that really seem like a reasonable match, is going to be a lot better and more targeted experience for both you and the hirer. And the other thing is, try to stand out with the absolute skills that you bring as an individual. So we already know you need the AI literacy and fluency. You need to be able to show that you can be effective and productive. But the other flip side of that is, equally, you've got to show that you're going to be a great colleague, that you're going to be collaborative, that you're, the eager beaver, and also a great communicator. So that human side needs to show up sharp, because that's where you're competing with everyone else.
I'm afraid that we are out of time for this episode, but I would love to have you back on. Is there anything
Uh,
today, though, that we haven't covered that you'd want to share with respect to this idea of workforce reckoning, of workers reckoning with this new reality, of employers reckoning with the new reality of AI and uncertainty?
I think we're still in the early days of AI and what it will mean. So I don't see this as being 3 years and we're done. I think in 3 years, we'll see a lot of progress made in terms of adoption and people kind of finding their way. But I think this is easily a 10-year story. I know that not everyone agrees with me, but I think it takes time. And like I said, I think there's a lot of small businesses that need to kind of catch up to where large ones are. So I think we have a longer way to go than many realize.
In 10
It's not
years,
overnight.
no, and not even 3 years. So what in 10 years are we talking about if we sit back down together?
I think in 10 years, when we sit back down together, we're talking about possibly that companies are structured very differently. Again, like I said, I think we're seeing a lot more flexibility in the labor market, which, by the way, is a healthy thing. The option to leave, the option to move and grow without being stuck in one silo. And I think we're seeing a lot more of that entrepreneurial spirit where people are actually almost selling their services and expertise, maybe to multiple companies at once. That could be, as you said, more vulnerable, but also possibly more empowering and flexible.
Like, I mean, I'm exposing myself here. It feels very vulnerable to be that
Yeah.
exact individual that you're describing, because my whole life I was trained to think that it was one job and one industry and you rise up a ladder. And like, I think to use your word earlier, it's a lattice, right? Now it's like, rock climbing. I'm going from one boulder to
That's
another.
right.
Without
It is
maybe
like rock climbing.
right? Without maybe needing to go up. I don't know. I mean, it seems like it has to be a mindset shift change. Do you think that most people or society at large is actually coming to terms with the fact that this is the new reality versus, there being a lot of stigma in the past around this idea of a freelancer or somebody who, is a gig economy worker. And just to wrap up my small rant on this is, I think a lot about actors, and no one ever judges actors for, being unemployed when they're in between shoots for movies or for TV shows.
Yeah, no, and I think that's right. And I think that, this vulnerability you're getting at, I actually think generations will save us. I think Gen Z right now is going to get us to where we want to be in 10 years. I think boomers, maybe not all of them, and most of them will have retired in 10 years. So their prior rubric of how they thought about jobs won't apply as much, but they also won't be in the workforce. They will be retired. So I think as Gen Z moves forward as this enormous population, along with millennials, they're going to embrace that flexibility. I think they're going to be more comfortable with it than the Gen X and the boomers have been.
Well, you're not forgotten. I have not forgotten you. I'm excited that we got together today. Thank you so much for your time, for your insights, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Hope.
Awesome. All righty.